Sometimes you may have to go to the hospital, and sometimes you may have to get an operation. But there are friendly nurses and doctors there to help you. Let's read Curious George Goes to the Hospital and see what happens when Curious George has to go to the hospital when he's not feeling well. Curious George Goes to the Hospital by Margaret and H.A. Ray. This is George. He lives with his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He was a good little monkey, but he was also curious. Today, George was curious about the big box on the man's desk. What could be in it? George could not resist. He simply had to open it. It was full of funny little pieces of all sorts of shapes and all sorts of colors. George took one out. It looked like a piece of candy. Maybe it was candy. Maybe he could eat it. George put the piece in his mouth, and before he knew it, he had swallowed it. A while later, the man with the yellow hat came home. "Why, George," he said, "I see you have already opened the box of the jigsaw puzzle. It was supposed to be a surprise for you. Well, let's get to work on it." Finally, the puzzle was finished. Well, almost finished. One piece was missing. The man looked for it everywhere, but he could not find it. "That's strange," he said. "It's a brand new puzzle." "Well, it can't be helped. Maybe we'll find it in the morning. Let's go to bed now, George." The next morning, George did not feel well. He had a tummy ache and did not want to eat his breakfast. The man was worried. He went to the telephone and called Dr. Baker. "I'll be over as soon as I can," said the doctor. First, Dr. Baker looked down George's throat and felt his tummy. Then he took out his stethoscope and listened. "I'm not sure what's wrong," he said. "You better take George to the hospital and have an x-ray taken. I'll call them and let them know you're coming." "Don't worry, George," said the man when they were driving to the hospital. "You have been there before when you broke your leg. Remember how nice the doctors and nurses were?" George held his big rubber ball tight as they walked up the hospital steps. A nurse took them down a long hallway to a room where she gave George something to drink that looked white and tasted sweet. "It is called barium," the nurse explained. "It helps the doctors find out what is wrong with you, George." In the next room stood a big table, and a doctor was putting on a heavy apron. Then he gave the man just one like it. George was curious. Would he get one too? No, he did not. "You get on that table, George," the doctor said. "I'm going to take some x-ray pictures of your insides." He pushed a little button and there was a funny noise. "There, now you may get up, and we will have the x-rays developed right away." "Now, let's see. There is something there that should not be," the doctor said when they were looking at the x-rays. "Why, that looks like... I think that might be the piece I was missing in our jigsaw puzzle yesterday," said the man. Well, well, well," said the doctor. "At least we know now what is wrong with our little patient. I'll tell Dr. Baker right away. George will have to stay at the hospital for a few days. They'll put a tube down his throat to get the piece out. It's only a small operation. I'll call a nurse and have her take you to the admitting office." Many people were waiting outside the office. George had to wait too. "Look, Betsy," the woman next to him said to her little girl. "There was Curious George." Betsy looked up for a moment, but she didn't even smile. Betsy had never been to a hospital before. She was scared. Finally, it was George's turn. A pretty young nurse took him to the next room. My, how many rooms and how many nurses there were. One nurse wrote down a lot of things about George, his name and his address, and what was wrong with him. Another nurse put a bracelet around his wrist. "It has your name on it, George," she said, "so that everybody knows who you are." Then the pretty young nurse came back. "My name is Carol," she said. "I'm going to take you to your room now. We call it the children's ward, and put you in your bed. There will be lots of children to keep you company." And so it was. There was a lot of children in the room. Some were up and around. Others were in their beds, with a nurse or a doctor looking after them. Dave was having a blood transfusion. Steve had his leg bandaged and was sitting in a go-kart. Betsy was on the bed looking sad. George got the bed next to Betsy. George was glad he was finally in his bed. His tummy was hurting again. The man sat with him for a while. "Now I have to leave you, George," he finally said. "I'll be back first thing in the morning before they take you to the operating room. Nurse Carol will tuck you in when it's time to go sleep." then he left. George just sat there and cried. As he had promised, the man was back early next morning. The nurses were keeping George very busy. One nurse was taking his temperature, one was taking his blood pressure, one was giving him a pill to make you sleepy, George, she said, and one was getting ready to give him a shot. It's gonna hurt, George, she said, but only for a moment. She took his arm and George let out a scream. But the needle hadn't touched you yet, said the nurse, laughing. There, now it's done. That wasn't so bad, was it? No, it really was not. And anyway, it was over now. By the time the lieutenant came with the stretcher to wheel him to the operating room, George was getting sleepy. He tried hard to stay awake. He was curious to see what would happen next. He could see a big table with big lamps over it and doctors and nurses all around. They had caps on their heads and masks over their faces. Only their eyes were showing. One of the doctors winked at George and patted his head. It was Dr. Baker, who had been to the house when it all had started. He looked funny with his mask on. And then George was fast asleep. When George woke up, he did not know what had happened. He didn't even know where he was. Then he saw Nurse Carol. It's all done, George, she said. They got the piece out. In a day or two, you'll be running around again. The man had brought him a picture book, but George felt sick and dizzy. His throat was hurting too. He was not even curious about the new book. He closed his eyes again. We'll let him sleep, said Nurse Carol. The more he sleeps, the better. The next morning, George felt better. He even ate a dish of ice cream. Dr. Baker came to see him, and the man, of course, came too. Betsy was watching him from time to time. She seemed a little less sad, but she still did not smile. Steve wheeled his go-kart over to George's bed. Tomorrow, I will get up and try to walk, he said. Boy, I can hardly wait. I'll take you to the playroom now, George, Nurse Carol said the next morning, and in the afternoon your friend will come and take you home. The playroom was full of children. A lady was showing Betsy how to use finger paint. There was all sorts of things to play with, even a puppet theater, and that was just a thing for George. He had 4 hands, so he could handle 4 puppets at the same time. George gave a real puppet show, with a dragon, a clown, a bear, and a police officer. The children laughed and shouted, and even Betsy, for the first time, smiled a little. There was a TV set in the playroom and also a record player. George was curious. If he climbed on the record player and turned the switch, would it go around and around like a merry-go-round? It did. It started slow. Then it went faster and faster and oh no! George had lost his balance and was sailing through the air. Luckily, George landed on a soft cushion. The children cheered and Betsy smiled again. George was so funny. But then the play lady picked George up. That's enough for now, she said. You better take a nap before lunch. We have a big day ahead of us. The mayor is coming to visit the hospital today, and later on, you'll be going home, George. George woke up. Steve was just taking his first steps. A nurse was helping him, and the children were watching. The go-kart was standing there empty. George was curious. He looked at it. Then he climbed into it. Then he grabbed the wheels, and then, while nobody was looking, he wheeled the go-kart right out of the room. George could make the go-kart go very fast. This was fun! Down the hall he went. By now the nurse had noticed that he was gone and came running after him. George! George! She shouted, but George was too excited to listen. He wheeled around the corner and down the ramp to the floor below, where some men were busy pushing lunch carts and a lot of doctors and nurses were showing the mayor around. George tried to stop, but it was too late. Wham! The go-kart landed right in the middle of everything. Lunch carts tumbled, spinach and scrambled eggs and strawberry jam were all over the floor. People fell over each other and George was thrown out of the go-kart and landed right in the mayor's arms. What a mess it was. You broke all my dishes, someone cried. He ruined the go-kart, complained another. What will the mayor think of it? Whispered someone else. And so it went. Suddenly, everybody looked up and listened. From above came happy laughter, and there stood Betsy, laughing, laughing, and laughing. Then the children joined in. Then the mayor started laughing, and finally everybody just laughed and laughed. Everybody, that is, except George. Betsy came running down the ramp, threw her arms around George, and kissed him. "Don't be sad, George," she said. "The whole thing was so funny. I never laughed so much in my life. I'm so glad you're here in the hospital with me." Now the director of the hospital spoke. "I am sorry this happened, Mr. Mayor," he said, "but I think we'll just clean up the mess and be done with it. George," he went on, "you've made a terrible mess, but you also made our sad little Betsy happy again, and that is more than any of us have done. And now I see your friend has come to take you home. So goodbye, George, and take good care of yourself." The children crowded around the windows waving goodbye when George and the man with the yellow hat were finally leaving the hospital. As the car was turning into the driveway, Nurse Carol came running after them. "Here's a little package with something that belongs to you, George," she called, "but don't open it until you get home." George was curious. Well, who wouldn't be? The moment he reached home, he ripped the paper off, tore open the box, and there was a piece of the puzzle that had caused all the trouble. "How nice of the doctor to save it for us," said the man with the yellow hat. "And now, we can finish the puzzle." Curious George is such a curious monkey that he ended up in the hospital. He had so much fun at the hospital with other children. Have you ever been to the hospital?